Okay, so our next speaker is Anthony Jack. Tony has a background in psychology and philosophy from Oxford, has a PhD in experimental psychology at London, working on visual awareness. He's also done a lot of stuff in cognitive neuroscience, on brain imaging, and has also done a lot of heavily foundational and philosophical work on issues tied to cognitive science and consciousness. So he's got a really broad background in these issues. He's currently in cognitive science at Case Western Reserve University, where he's running the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness Lab, as well as having secondary appointments in philosophy, psychology, bioethics, and neurology. And I hear that anesthesiology, physics, and mysticism are just around the corner. His talk today is "Why Don't Psychopaths Believe in Dualism?" Please welcome Anthony.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to jump right into some questions which I think lie at the heart of why people come to this conference. So I'm just going to give you a few different questions, and if you have any comments at the end about other ones I could use, I'll be very happy to. I'm going to keep running some of these things. So here's a question. Thoughts and feelings are nothing more than the activity of neurons. Clearly relates to some positions advanced here. The mind can be understood completely by thinking of it like a very complicated computer. Maybe just want to keep track of your feeling about the answers to these. Scientists will succeed in making a robot that can experience and feel. There is life of some form or another after death. Humans have a soul. And now here's a rather more complicated one due to Sean Nichols, who's just down the road, and about free will. So imagine a universe in which everything that happens is completely caused by whatever happened before it. This is true from the very beginning of the universe. So what happened in the beginning of the universe caused what happened next, and so on right up until the present. For example, one day John decided to have French fries at lunch, and like everything else, this decision was completely caused by what happened before. So if everything in this universe was exactly the same up until John made his decision, then it had to happen that John would decide to have French fries. Now imagine universe B, in which almost everything that happens is completely caused, but the one exception is human decision-making. So now we can consider Mary, who features in many of these stories, decided to have French fries at lunch. Since a person's decision in this universe is not completely caused by what happened before it, even if everything in the universe was exactly the same up until Mary made her decision, it did not have to happen that Mary would decide to have French fries. So you can ask yourself, where do you think our universe lies? Is it more like universe A, the completely determined universe, or more like universe B? Okay, well, these are certainly challenging questions. And I think that there's three, we can crudely characterize there are three broad positions which have been adopted within to try and address them. So one is the idea that there is a mechanism, consciousness mechanism camp, where scientists will be able to identify the neural, or perhaps not neural, but some other physical basis of these phenomena, the soul, free will, phenomenal consciousness. Another camp is the demystifying camp, which I guess Kevin partly sits in, which is that the idea that soul, free will, and phenomenal consciousness are an illusion, at least in part. That is, they may concede that they may claim there are parts that can be explained using scientific theories, other parts that can't. And that we should ignore the rest, the hard problem, or the problem of phenomenal consciousness, because it's not a properly posed question. Now there's another position which maybe Dave adopts. I'm not quite sure if how close it would be to his, but which I think is rather nicely articulated by Stephen Jay Gould, which is an idea that the soul, free will, and phenomenal consciousness do exist, but they belong to an entirely separate realm, which science can never fully capture. And what I want to do is articulate a position like this, which is almost entirely not articulated within the scientific literature. That is, pretty much everyone either thinks there will be a mechanism or that there isn't a proper question. But I want to actually claim to you that the science suggests, if anything, that this would be the best position. So what I'm doing here is I'm offering you an account which I like to think of is in the neuroscience of philosophy. We've had a lot of philosophy of neuroscience and philosophy of psychology, and I think it's time for something a little bit new. So I'm not going to give you a scientific account of consciousness, and I'm going to point to this very rapid dismissal of all of those, but I am going to aim to give you at least a scientific account of the problem of consciousness. So how did the problem come about? So I suggest actually that this may be a larger research agenda, and certainly I think I have some friends in the XFI camp who are interested in a similar sort of approach. So the idea here is that philosophical paradoxes don't actually reflect schisms in nature, right, or in reality, but they really reveal features of the cognitive architecture that we have evolved to understand that reality. So that's the story I'm going to give you. Okay, well, obviously our cortex has expanded massively compared with many of the other animals that scientists study and use to tell us about the structure of cognition. Here you can see colored in blue is the prefrontal cortex, just a lateral view of it. We'll be talking more about the medial, the in-between surfaces in a bit. And you can see that that in particular has massively expanded. So what on earth is all this cortex doing? And it's 3 times larger, even adjusting for body size, than that of any other animal in the human. Why do we have quite so many neurons, quite so much brain? And what I want to suggest is that while cognitive psychologists and cognitive scientists tend to talk mostly about processes, that really the function of all this cortex is to support extremely complex representations. We use extremely complex representations to navigate our world and to guide our interactions, right? And I want to suggest further that maybe this complexity shouldn't be understood as just being one system, but rather there are 2 centers of gravity to this system, maybe more than 2, but at least I want to talk about 2 centers of gravity to this system. Okay, so that's the idea in terms of the science I'm going to talk about. Now I'm going to switch back into philosophy, and I'm going to try and enumerate a position that I'm going to use to guide that work. So this is from Dennett, and this position is an extension of Dennett's work, right? So this is the physical stance, which is one way of trying to understand the world. From this stance, our predictions are based on the actual physical state of the particular object and are worked out by applying whatever knowledge we have of the laws of nature. Instances of prediction from the physical stance are common enough. If you turn on that switch, you'll get a nasty shock, and when the snows come, that branch will break right off. Okay, so we have the physical stance. Now, Dennett, of course, enumerated famously another stance, the intentional stance. Here's how it works. First, you decide to treat the object whose behavior is to be predicted as a rational agent. I bolded that because it may seem the first flag of a serious problem coming. Then you figure out what beliefs that agent ought to have, given its place in the world and its purpose. Then you figure out what desires it ought to have. A little practical reasoning from the chosen set of beliefs and desires will lead to a prediction about what the agent will do. So notice that both of these stances are about prediction. So there we have the intentional stance, which I've made small because it doesn't figure that much in my story. Okay, but Dennett also enumerated another stance. He hasn't said all that much about it, but he points out that one is guilty of no monstrosities if one dismembers the computer with whom one plays chess, or even the robot with whom one has long conversations. So, and then he goes on to say, maybe we need a personal stance, which is just an annexation of the intentional stance with moral commitment, right? Well, I'm not going to get into this, but there was various reasons why we were upset with this view. We didn't think it captured everything, and this is largely to do with a lot of work I did many years ago on trying to understand the nature of our experience. And Dennett has a position on that with heterophenomenology, in which he essentially attempts to collapse descriptions of experience into information that can be gleaned from objective experiments. And I felt that this didn't quite capture what was going on, and that in fact we have 2 quite distinct ways of understanding the mental, right? A first or second person experiential perspective, and a third person in which is the viewpoint of science, where we see the self or other as an object. We focus on their behavior, their performance, and the mechanisms inside them that might give rise to them. So the idea here is, yes, we use both in everyday life, that's no problem, but the claim is, at least in scientific and philosophical context, these two forms of understanding need to be really carefully distinguished, right, and not conflated together. Right? And the claim is that many confusions arise from the failure to do that. So let me now try and give you some more. So now we're updating this idea of his personal stance, and now we've moved it into the phenomenal stance. So let me give you a little explanation of the phenomenal stance. So this is the stance, and this is updated from a paper written with the philosopher Philip Robbins in 2006. This is a stance we adopt when we reflect upon our own experiences and feelings, as well as the experiences and feelings of others. And it's a stance that we tend to avoid if we feel no compassion for the other, in which case we deny or dismiss their feelings. The phenomenal stance allows us to make sense of our own feelings and construct a coherent self-narrative. And entering into this stance towards another deepens our relationship with them and our sense of commitment to them, including moral commitment. This is the stance which, when it's guiding another person's interaction with us, makes us feel understood. And I want to pause particularly on that notion of understood, because I think it's one that just about anyone can grasp, that there is this concept of being understood in that way. To adopt the phenomenal stance more formally towards an object or towards X is to first of all regard it as a locus of phenomenal experience, an experiencing subject, and secondly as a target of moral concern. So those are the key claims that we're linking together in the phenomenal stance. So now we add the phenomenal stance to this picture of different types of understanding, and then the particular claim we're making is that the physical stance and the phenomenal stance are mutually exclusive. Or if you like, they are inhibitory of each other, right? So these are two forms of understanding that are disjoint. Whereas the intentional stance we see as having talk between either of these other types of understanding, right? So you can think of your computer as having goals if it's a sophisticated computer and maybe a robot, but you may want to deny it feelings. You can certainly think of other people as having goals and beliefs that relate to their feelings, right? So the intentional stance and the interaction between the intentional and the physical stance is, of course, how Dennett attempts to explain away the problem of consciousness. We want to explain it in terms of there being a genuine inhibition between these two stances. And I'll just add that there's also, this relates to work in neuropsychology, so we see there is different disorders involved, disorders in different types of understanding. So Williams syndrome in the physical stance, Williams syndrome, people are very warm, incidentally, very socially warm and talkative. Psychopathy involving a deficit in the phenomenal stance, not so warm, but quite talkative still. And then people with autism having a failure in the intentional stance, where this is more of a problem with theory of mind. Although I would say that I think autism is a horrible grab bag of different things going on, and it's not clean from a scientific point of view in a way that psychopathy and Williams probably is more cleaner. Okay, so we're updating Dennett's map here, and here are the key points to how we're updating it. We're adding experiential understanding to this personal stance. We've got this claim that there's a direct interplay between regarding something as having phenomenal states and treating it as an object of moral concern, and that this goes both ways, right? And we're essentially now sort of making life simpler for philosophers, because instead of needing to worry about a separate problem of consciousness and free will, we're just lumping both of those together and putting it in with the naturalistic fallacy, right? That is, so now we're seeing problems about moral realism as closely related to problems of consciousness and free will. We are seeing, and we're not seeing the intentional stance as particularly critical to the tension that gives rise to this problem of consciousness. But we do regard this tension as real, as genuine. We're taking the explanatory gap very seriously. We don't see it as due to faulty reasoning. In fact, there's evidence that it is actually associated with healthy reasoning in a number of, not just in psychopathy, but in a number of different disorders, that the tension, that to have this tension between the stances is part of healthy cognition. And so we regard this as a genuine and unavoidable product of our cognitive structure. Okay, now let's just decompose this idea that there's a link between phenomenal consciousness and moral concern, and this can go two ways. One way from thinking something's conscious to treating it as an object of moral concern. I don't really want to say that much about that because I think that's so intuitive. And anyway, Jeremy Bentham said it an awfully long time ago when he said, if we want to consider if we should be concerned with the welfare of creatures, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but is can they suffer? So it is, do they have the phenomenal properties, not the intentional properties? Going the other way, we made a prediction in our paper that the psychopath who doesn't treat other individuals as objects of moral concern shouldn't perceive the problem of consciousness. So let me just say a little bit more about the psychopath or the psychopathic profile, because I don't want you to have the idea that this is someone who necessarily goes out and murders people. Most people, which current science would regard as having the primary psychopathic trait of callous affect, in fact, never really commit any terrible crimes at all. Some of the other traits associated with psychopathy of Machiavellian thinking, impulsivity, and criminal tendencies are generally regarded as secondary traits by the people who are experts in this field. This tendency of callous affect, this lack of concern for others, also applies to the self. So these are very happy-go-lucky, charming, glib people. You may very much enjoy talking to them until you get in a bad situation, right? But they don't respond to negative reinforcement well or to punishment. It's thought to be due to an amygdala deficit. It's extremely heritable. So there's a recent study that shows that it's very highly genetically heritable with very little environmental influence. A huge study, very nicely done study. It's also measurable within the normal population, even that select group of normals that we call undergraduates, via self-report. And the measure I'm going to use is one that's done by the experts in the field, so Del Paulhaus and Robert Hare. So let's go back to those questions, and you can contemplate again how you answered, and then think about these things a little bit. So what I've done is I've split up each of these questions according to whether people lean towards the dualistic answer or lean towards the monistic or physicalist answer to these questions. And what we can see is that on the questions humans have a soul, clearly those who lean towards a more monistic answer score a lot higher on the callous affect scale. Similarly for there's life after death. Similarly, but not so strong, for the mind is like a computer. Well, there will be conscious robots is the only one that wasn't significant in itself. Feelings are just neural activity is pretty good. Gangbusters is humans' decisions are determined. Now, if you can't correlate within this sample because they're not normal. I'm not going to bore you with things like this, but all those questions cohere quite well, which is a measure called Cronbach's alpha. And then when you look at the correlation with callous affect between all of these things glommed together, you get a reasonable negative correlation. We saw R minus 0.3, and similarly for non-parametric. Okay, so when you hear things like this, I imagine that the mind immediately goes to something, to salacious, gossipy type thoughts. And obviously I realize this is the only reason I'm in a plenary session is because it makes Dave look good. But I really don't want you to go there, actually, because note that the correlation is fairly modest, right? And I think that when it comes to people who are really thinking about intellectual concerns that are pushing them one way or another, I think that's a different matter. This is in a normal population who are essentially philosophically naive. And, I think I'd rather keep my studies in that population for now, partly because I just don't want to deal with the psychopaths. Okay, so coming back to this idea of dualism and moral concern and their relationships, well, in fact, the other way around, if you deny the soul or you deny free will, there's a couple of nice papers that indicate that you get more antisocial behavior, you get more cheating, you have more unpleasantness to other people, right? This is two different papers, each of which had a number of different experiments. So this is very solid finding, right? And they use things like an excerpt from Crick's book telling people that they don't have a soul and their idea they have free will is an illusion, and that turns them a little bit antisocial. Now we are presenting this data as going in the other way, but I have to admit, of course, it's just a correlation. And so the direction or the question of a third factor is important. I think the heritability of callousness and the fact it's relevant to everyday life, whereas arguably, apart from you guys, the relevance to everyday life of monism versus dualism is somewhat low, right? So for our sample. So I think it's more likely to be in that direction. But this is work in progress, and we're keeping on looking at things and whether there could be a factor of religious belief. The initial data suggests that that is a factor but can't explain it all. Anyway, what might be going on? And now I've got to get to the brain, right? So what might be going on here that could explain how this could come about, that we could have this negative relationship in these things? Well, now there's an awful lot of research now that looks at how you engage in scientific, logical, numerical reasoning. This is actually from a meta-analysis we did in our lab. It's a little bit more formal than most of the other meta-analyses that have been published, but clearly what it indicates is there's a number of areas on the lateral surface which are in intraparietal sulcus and lateral frontal cortex, which are associated with this type of analytic thinking, right? You now see a very different set of areas, and they tend to be more on the medial surface of the brain, which are involved in social cognition, so in emotion and emotion regulation, in thinking about your own feelings, introspecting and thinking about who you are, and in a variety of social reasoning tasks that involve empathetic perspective taking, right? So we get a different set of reasons. So there's some evidence here that there's a conceptual divide. That is, that the mechanism supporting what I'd like to call empirical understanding, right, the evidence of the senses, are, and also higher order empirical understanding, like understanding of physics and mechanical reasoning, that they're then in very different regions to the regions that support the concepts we use to understand other minds, at least in the sorts of social interactions that are presented by scientists in the scanner. Of course, autism also suggests some distinction between these types of understanding. So this wouldn't seem to account for what's going on in the explanatory gap, where there's some sort of disjoint. What might be a better analogy for the explanatory gap is something like this duck-rabbit illusion, where you can either see the duck or you can see the rabbit, but you cannot see both at once, right? So you can either understand the feeling someone has, or you can understand how their mind is working, but to some extent there's some disjoint between the two. You can't quite bring them together. You see, if you focus on one, the other seems to fleet into the distance, and vice versa. Well, why might that be happening in the brain? Well, now there's a very big phenomena that has been talked about recently in the brain, which is often referred to as the default network. And what scientists have discovered, and they've been mainly focused when they do imaging tasks on what brain areas are active when you give someone a task, right, on the assumption that active areas are associated with the cognitive components of the task you give someone. But it's been noted there are a number of regions that tend to be deactivated when you give someone a task, as compared with when they're just left to think their own thoughts at rest. And that has come to be called the default network, and it's come to be a big puzzle and of great interest in neuroscience in the last decade. So 2001 was a paper that first described it. So we now know that there are actually two networks, often referred to as task-positive and a default mode network. And the task-positive network tends to be activated during most tasks that psychologists give, and the default network deactivated. Now, it turns out that those two networks, even if you leave someone at rest in the scanner, so they're just thinking their own thoughts, tend to be negatively or correlated. It's often referred to as anti-correlated networks. So there seems to be a push-pull relationship between these. And over time, we are constantly switching between these two networks. You are constantly switching between these two networks. A task will push you more into one network or into another, but even when a task pushes you, there is residual fluctuation between these networks, right? So this is a constant process that's going on in your brain all the time. Now, like I said, this has been a big thing. It's really taken off. It's interest in this in neuroscience. But nonetheless, there's been a big problem about understanding what it really means. A unique challenge for understanding the functions of the brain's default network is that the system is most active in passive settings and during tasks that direct attention away from external stimuli. It's a recent review. So there's some question about what it does, but usually it's been framed and discussed as being a distinction between external and internal attention, between perception and introspection. And this doesn't quite work with my framework, so I did a study to see if I could show that that wasn't quite what it was. So what we did in this study was we gave people physics problems, right, and we showed them either as text or as a movie. The movies are taken from the Video Encyclopedia of Physics. And we gave them social stories or social movies. And these are really about, they involve both understanding people's intentional states, but also understanding how they're feeling, and in rather complex ways. So for instance, in the social movies, there's always a question about whether one person understood what the other person was feeling. And importantly, we had rest periods as well, so we could just compare this with a resting baseline. And there's a massive difference in what brain areas you recruit, but the main point I want to make isn't about the fact that there's a massive difference. It's to do with these brighter areas that you can see. And in these brighter areas, well, the pattern you see is that when you're doing the physics tasks in this physics region, you activate this area. When you're doing the social tasks, you deactivate it, right? And you see the same vice versa for the social areas. So you have these two sets of areas that are in this push-pull relationship. One is when you engage in one type of reasoning, you're turning the other one off. And that also fits perfectly with the anti-correlated areas. Okay, so there are some provisos to make. I need to kind of move on, right? But I think what this is suggesting is that there is a neural basis for why we think of the phenomenal and the physical as fundamentally disjoint, right? We're seeing a neural competition between these two. Okay, so now I run into a little bit of trouble with time, but I'm going to so I'll make some very brief remarks about. Now, in fact, you might wonder, is this relevant to moral decision making? And in fact, we know already that there is a push-pull between two sets of areas from the work of Joshua Green, and these areas correspond exactly with the areas that I've described. And so what it looks like is that when you're faced with a dilemma that requires you to harm another person, you're activating these regions, which are social regions, and they're putting the brakes on you being willing to do this action, even though it would be for the greater good. So I think that what these social areas are really doing is that they are contributing to a perception that other people have a soul. And we've done a number of different experiments to help us get a feel for that. We've looked at dehumanizing people, which of course when groups are dehumanized, very real social phenomena, then atrocities are committed against them. And we've also looked at the correlation with callous affect for whether you are willing to commit these, or whether you say you'd be willing to commit these harmful actions to other people. And again, we see a correlation with the callous affect scores, and we see these same brain regions implicated. So to conclude, Levine, who of course came up with the explanatory gap, tells us that the explanatory gap argument doesn't demonstrate a gap in nature, but a gap in our understanding of nature. Of course, a plausible explanation for there being a gap in our understanding of nature is that there is a genuine gap in nature. But so long as we have countervailing reasons for doubting the latter, we have to look elsewhere for an explanation of the former. And what I want to suggest to you is that examining our neurocognitive structure for an explanation of the gap both fits a scientific worldview and actually looks like a very productive research agenda, which is giving us lots of good behavioral and brain imaging data. So here's a little depiction of the explanatory gap, and the common thought is it lies out there. It lies out in the world, and the common strategy is to try and find a bridge between these two types of between these two aspects of nature, rather, I should say, is the common view. I want to suggest that it's an illusion to imagine we can find this bridge. What we need to understand is that the explanatory gap is actually inside us, and it's a problem that occurs when we try to think about cognition, right? Because when we're trying to think about cognition, we're doing something essentially unnatural. We're using a scientific worldview, which we use to manipulate objects in order to understand persons, which we naturally use a completely different network to understand and to guide our interactions with them. So really, rather than think of Rodin's marvelous thinker who you might imagine would be able to integrate his different types of thinking. I think we have to have a slightly more desultory view of the capacities of our mind. We are unfortunately hampered by our cognitive architecture, and in particular by a very powerful distinction in our brains between our mechanisms for understanding minds and our mechanisms for understanding machines. Thank you.
Okay, a little bit of time for questions. Tobias?
Very brief. Why did you leave out the functional stance? And second, what is the difference of your view to McGinn's view?
So what was the first question?
Why did you leave out the functional stance? I thought that was doing all the work in Dennett's theory, but you didn't mention it.
Yeah.
All these functionalists.
Okay, because I'm really interested in the phenomenal and the physical, I guess. Let me answer the other question about Colin McGinn. Right, so Colin McGinn's view is that there is something about our cognitive architecture which prevents us from understanding what the bridge is, right? So he's still got the bridge out there in the world, right? And the cognitive architecture is a limitation. I'm saying more that the appearance that there is this unbridgeable gap is coming from our cognitive architecture. So does that make sense? Yeah, a little bit, right. I would actually say that my own view is that the phenomenal consciousness, free will, and souls do exist, right? And in fact, you know, if you don't think they exist, I don't want to play with you because you're probably not very nice. But so I mean, I absolutely believe there are moral truths and that people genuinely have experiences, right? I just don't think the tools of science can be applied directly to them. Now, I think there's a lot of crossplay between science and between understanding someone's phenomenal states, and between science and understanding what's the right thing to do is. Certainly they can inform each other a great deal, but my view is that in order to inform each other profitably, you first have to understand that those ways of understanding the world are based in fundamentally different conceptual schemes. And so we need to be very careful to separate out where our evidence is coming from.
Thanks. I'm inclined to think of the explanatory gap in the case of mind and body, let's say, as one of a member of a family of gaps which are sort of metaphysical in nature, like, for example, the gap between moral facts and natural facts, or the gap between facts of physical necessitation, causation, and chance, and let's say facts about patterns of properties, instantiation across the world, for example, and many others. And so when you put forward the idea that the mind-body explanatory gap is a sort of, can be thought of as reflecting a certain architecture of our minds, it seems that doesn't have any application for these broader sort of metaphysical gaps. So I'm just wondering...
Well, to moral facts, it's exactly, I mean, we're trying to collapse it
exactly.
into that problem.
Okay, now maybe that's interesting in the case of moral facts, but these other, you know, there are all sorts of, let's say, the gap between the world of physical necessitation, laws, and chance, and the world of, let's say, patterns of property instantiation in a 4D world. I mean, these are things that you've got these people having these endless debates about these.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just wondering if you could have a broader picture, let's say, about the architecture of mind and mind.
You know, I said that I had this research agenda, and I'm just, I mean, I think I'm already being, I think some of my less favorable reviewers sound grandiose. So, you know, the idea is that philosophical paradoxes in general reflect something to reflect features of our cognition rather than actually reflecting reality. But I'm taking this one problem at a time, okay? I mean, you know, but yes, I think most paradoxes will eventually resolve into, I think if you want to do good philosophy, go to the scanner, right?
So it's very nice for these two networks, but I wanted to issue some skepticism about applying it to the explanatory gap. And one way to put forward the skepticism is by drawing on the analogy of the duck rabbit. The duck rabbit. So in the duck rabbit case, you can sort of keep one profile in mind or in focus at a time. So they suppress one another to a certain extent. But they don't completely suppress one another. One can sort of remember the other one when one focuses on the second one and vice versa. And so one can sort of keep them, one can compare them in a way, and one doesn't have any problem seeing that they're one and the same, even if one can just focus on one at a time. So it could be just the same with this mind and the brain. You can sort of activate one or the other. It doesn't seem to be a general reason to believe that when you have these processes that anti-correlate, that it should be hard to see that they are one and the same, as illustrated by the
I mean, I do
diagram.
think that they're one and the same. I mean, I am a physicalist in this sense, right? So, I mean, actually the position I hold is very similar to how you say it. That is, I mean, it is well shown that you really can't entertain both perceptions in their full detail at once, right? And I think that's the explanatory gap. That's where the analogy works. I also think the analogy works for what you're saying, that you can, if you come at it with the right type of understanding, you can understand that they are one and the same. But I think for your average person, right, with the naive person who hasn't been tutored in this view of why they might have this impression that persons and mechanisms aren't identical, they're just going to go to dualism. It's a more immediate way to interpret, right, this strange bifurcation in the perception. Does that make sense?
Well, many people who are very tutored retain this sense of distinctness. Many physicalists keep feeling that there is an explanatory gap, and I don't know if that's explained then, given that there is no general reason to suppose that these
So I'm a physicalist.
when processes suppress one another, that they seem distinct.
But I'm a physicalist, and I think there's an explanatory gap. This is not a position that's usually, and I don't think that any scientific thing will close a gap. But it's not an unusual position, but I don't think it's inconsistent.
It's not unusual, isn't it? This is a very common position isn't it the most common position among physicalists? Hold there are distinct, a conceptual gap, but no ontological gap. And they hold that the... okay, I just said, I'm not sure it's so unusual. It seems to me it's a version of the most popular position among physicalists these days. It holds there is a conceptual and an explanatory gap, but it's wholly epistemological and not ontological.
Oh, well,
in fact, I think,
unlike the phenomenal concepts type work. Sorry, I shouldn't have said physical. I mean, I think most scientists don't hold.
I see.
But, yeah, okay.
I think of Thomas Nagel as having pioneered this in his
absolutely.
1974 article. He has his footnote saying maybe we just have two fundamentally different concepts.
Yeah, and which Christopher Hill then went, yes, no, I see. The position is very similar to that. But it's not a very big part of the field right now, that position. I mean...
Maybe it depends where you're coming from. But, yeah.
Right.
Last one?
Just a quick question to maybe direct future research. No question about what you've discovered. There may be a complexity or a higher level, I don't know how to say it better, but you talk about this applying to the average or the naive person. My question to you would be this: investigate whether you would rather be employed by or imprisoned by a determinist who had empathy than a moralist who was just a strong moralist.
We're doing that research, so thank you. Yeah, so we're doing research where we see how people's moral judgments change as a factor of both their level of empathy and their belief in the soul. And you can flip the correlations in some cases, right? So you can have one correlation to do an action, and then you tell them there isn't a soul, and you flip it. So, but that's all work in progress. But yes, thank you. I think that's very interesting.
Thank you. Okay, our final speaker is Philip Goff. Philip has his PhD in philosophy from the University of Reading, and he's now a lecturer in philosophy at Liverpool and also a research fellow at the Center for Consciousness at ANU that I direct. He's done a lot of important and influential work already in the last few years on the mind-body problem, quite a lot on panpsychism, first writing a paper which involved a big objection to panpsychism, now often called the Goff's problem, before changing his mind and taking up panpsychism himself. Number of other important works on phenomenal concepts and the like. He has a book coming out one of these days developing his own take on the mind-body problem, and the talk today is all about panpsychism and crazy people. So please welcome Philip.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? So I've added a little subtitle there to prepare you for the madness I'm about to propose. So the discipline of physics has, for the last 400 or 500 years, gone very, very well, right? And I think this is the result of two things. Firstly, its close concern with observation, and secondly, the fact that it restricts its scope of inquiry to what can be described mathematically. So I think this begins with Galileo, but I think it's only a little bit later with Descartes that we get a fully worked out picture of the physical world. Am I audible? Better. So this begins with Galileo, but a little later with Descartes, we get, possibly for the first time, a fully worked out metaphysical picture of the physical world, such that its nature can be completely captured in mathematics. So the qualitative properties of Aristotle's universe are replaced by quantitative properties of pure geometry. And it's not that Descartes didn't believe in qualitative properties, it's just that he put them all in the mind, an entity he took to be distinct from the physical world. And so by doing this, he was able to give a completely mathematical description of what remained of the natural world. So I think this is sort of the start of mathematical physics. And that's gone really, really well, right? We've systematically built up a rich body of information about the natural world, and that information has allowed us to manipulate the natural world in all sorts of extraordinary ways, building spacecraft and lasers and hairdryers, and it's all great. So then, in this historical narrative, so I think when you get to the 20th century, you find philosophers are just so impressed by how well science has gone, and so sort of depressed at how badly metaphysics has gone, that they form a strong inclination to look to physics for the complete metaphysical truth, right? There's a feeling that there's something here that's worked, right? There's something here that's proved itself. There's something here that's we can put our metaphysical faith in. And so we get physicalism in the sort of mid-20th century, which is roughly the view that physics can in principle give us a complete description of reality. So I don't think physicalism can succeed for a familiar reason that I don't think we can give an adequate physicalist account of consciousness. And I'm not going to try and demonstrate that here in 25 minutes. But, I will say that I think we shouldn't be surprised that physicalism is destined to fail. Because physics begins with Galileo and Descartes putting the mind outside of the scope of inquiry, right? So Galileo and Descartes kind of say, let's just put qualitative mentality on one side. Let's just concentrate on describing the mathematically capturable causal structure of the world, right? That's an approach that's proved to be very successful. But crucially, I think the success is a result of narrowing the scope of inquiry, putting the mind outside of the scope of inquiry. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that an approach that begins with, setting the mind outside of the scope of inquiry ends up not being able to account for the mind. So, I mean, this is my sort of historical narrative. I think, in the first plenary, there's this sort of narrative that anti-physicalists such as myself are going against the onward march of science. But I think this view is sort of, and I think we got this narrative a little bit from Susan and Leonard in the first plenary. But I think this narrative is grounded in a sort of very contentious view of science, that it's trying to capture the complete metaphysical truth, and I would just dispute that conception of science. Okay, so I think that our contemporary situation is that natural science is going really well, great, but metaphysics is a mess. And by metaphysics, I simply mean philosophical investigation into the nature of reality. So for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, philosophers were, at least in the Anglo-American tradition, were very hostile to metaphysics. From the 70s onwards, they've sort of gotten more enthusiastic about it, but I think we're still not doing it very well, right? We still don't have, a body of information to teach our undergraduates. It's embarrassing. I teach undergraduate metaphysics in Liverpool, and there's still sort of no body of metaphysical truth to teach. So it's a bit of a mess. And I think really what the problem is, there's just no proper methodology, right? Contemporary metaphysics largely in sort of David Loews tradition, sort of very influential 20th century metaphysician, is partly about weighing theoretical virtues, but it's also largely about consulting common sense intuition. And I fail to see how this is supposed to be a kind of credible principle of theory choice, right? If we're interested in serious investigation of this nature of the natural world, why should what the average Joe kind of pre-theoretically thinks about things have any bearing? So I think this is sort of, analogous to sort of pre-scholastic kind of stabbings in the dark before the scientific revolution. Okay, so I think there's this problem that there's no kind of really worked out methodology for metaphysics. But I think once one gives up on physicalism, which is still sort of dominant view, I think once one gives up on physicalism, a methodology naturally emerges. So if you're an anti-physicalist or your standard anti-physicalist, there are two ways of getting information about the natural world, right? There's facts about causal structure that we can know from physics and perhaps from natural science more generally, and there are facts about the existence and nature of consciousness that we know from our own first-person acquaintance with conscious experience. So if you think there are these two sources of information, it's natural to think of metaphysics as the project of bringing together these two kinds of fact in a unified picture of the natural world. And that's how I conceive of metaphysics. So I call this a kind of neo-Cartesian conception of metaphysics. And I hope that philosophers at some point sort of start getting on with this. Okay, so metaphysics, as I conceive it, is the project of bringing together empirical facts about causal structure, introspectable facts about consciousness, into a single unified picture of the world. And there are obviously lots of ways of doing this, but the trick is, the job of the metaphysician is to try and find the most theoretically virtuous such picture. And this is going to involve comparing various metaphysical hypotheses along various dimensions of theoretical virtue, so simplicity, economy, explanatory power, unity, these kind of familiar things. So for example, I take it Cartesian dualism, substance dualism, and phenomenalism or idealism will both do the job, but it looks like they're not going to do it in a very theoretically satisfying way. So the substance dualist explains empirical facts by postulating physical substances and facts about consciousness by postulating mental substances, and they take these to be two very different kinds of substance. And this leads to a sort of disunified, unparsimonious picture of the world. Alternatively, idealists or phenomenalists explain facts about the physical world in terms of facts about conscious experience. So maybe facts about there being a table here to do with what subjects will experience in various conditions. Maybe this is something like what Deepak Chopra was trying to defend, was defending in the first plenary. But my worry about this picture, it avoids the sort of disunity and profligacy of dualism, because it's a sort of monistic picture, there's just one kind of stuff. But I think if properly worked out, it ends up quite an inelegant picture of the world, because it looks like you're going to end up with all these complicated, brute, counterfactual truths about what subjects are going to experience in certain conditions, with nothing sort of grounding them. I mean, Berkeley grounded these truths in God, but I mean, that's a big ontological commitment again. So it looks like phenomenalism is going to be horribly inelegant at base. So it would be good to try and find something more theoretically satisfying. And now it seems to me, prima facie, panpsychism looks to be the most elegant, unified, theoretically virtuous way of bringing these two kinds of fact together. So for the panpsychist, there's just one kind of stuff, but we know about its causal structure. We know about it in two different ways. We know about its causal structure empirically, and we know about its intrinsic nature through introspection. So consciousness of some form or other constitutes the intrinsic nature of the natural world. So panpsychism avoids the disunity and the profligacy of dualism, and it also avoids the inelegance of phenomenalism or idealism. Now, the most common objection to panpsychism that one gets all the time is just, that's mad, it's crazy, man. And, again, I just can't see why this is supposed to have any kind of force at all. I mean, Einstein tells us some crazy things about the nature of time. How seriously would we take science saying, hold on, Albert, this is a little bit different to how we pre-theoretically think about things. I mean, so what? I just think, these kind of considerations have very little force. I think it's the theoretical virtue of a hypothesis, not its fit with pre-theoretical common sense, that's important. So I think panpsychism is a very attractive position, and it's one we should be thinking very seriously about. But it does face quite a serious problem, much discussed in the literature, the combination problem. I'm starting to think just that's what I'd like to call it, the composition problem, for reasons I might explain. But, okay, anyway, roughly the idea is it's difficult to make sense of what we might call phenomenal composition. It's difficult to make sense of roughly little subjects of experience coming together to form a big subjective experience. It's difficult to make sense of that. So when we're thinking of objects just in terms of their physical properties, it seems we have a grip on composition. I mean, to take a very simple case, you know, two 10-kilogram objects, stick them together to make a 20-kilogram object. Okay, seems we have a grip on that. But when it comes to the phenomenal case, things just don't look that easy. So, I mean, let's just take a kind of toy example. Imagine we're trying to make sense of 10 subjects of experience that are all feeling slight pain and coming together to compose a subject of experience that feels severe pain. I mean, I don't know, it's a sort of as plausible an example of phenomenal composition as I could think of, which is not to say it's very plausible, but let's just try and make sense of that. I mean, maybe we can make sense of the little subjects sort of merging and losing their identity and, you know, being replaced by this very pained subject. Maybe we can make sense of that. But I don't think that's how we ordinarily understand composition. So return to the case, the physical case, right? It's not that the two 10-kilogram weights merge and lose, then disappear and are replaced by a 20-kilogram weight. It's rather that each of the 10-kilogram weights is still there, each has the property of having 10 kilograms, but somehow they're being there and having the property of 10 kilograms somehow adds up to the 20-kilogram object. And it's that, I think, that we find very, very difficult to make sense of in the phenomenal case, right? The idea that these 10 subjects feeling slight pain could still be there, still each feeling slight pain, but somehow add up to an 11th subject feeling severe pain. I mean, that's just very difficult to make sense of. Why do we need, as panpsychists, to make sense of phenomenal composition? Well, it's natural to think that my mind, the subject of my experience, is a composite object, right? My brain, or a large part of my brain, something composed of a very large number of neurons. And if you're a panpsychist, you think the intrinsic nature of the physical world is constituted of conscious experience. So it looks like we're going to have to think that the neurons constituted by their own kind of conscious experience, the brain has my conscious experience, and somehow the little neurons with their conscious experience add up to my brain with its conscious experience, right? So it looks like we're going to need phenomenal composition, but it's something that's very difficult to make sense of. I sort of go back and forth over whether I think it's sort of incoherent or whether no one's found any way of making sense of it, but clearly it's a very difficult problem. Okay, let's get some water. It's a little bit parched.
You might just say explicitly what panpsychism is.
Didn't I say that? So Dave's just said, did I say what panpsychism was? So I take panpsychism to be the view that there's just one natural world, but the intrinsic nature of that world is consciousness. So any physical objects there are, their intrinsic nature is constituted by some form of consciousness. I call this non-compositional panpsychism, where all subjects of experience are simple objects with no spatial parts. Okay, now the problem with this, I mean, this is fine if you're a substance dualist, if you think the mind is sort of has no spatial location, is outside of space, then it's fine to think it has no spatial parts. But if you, that's not the view I want, right? If you want to think that the mind has a spatial location, but it's a simple object, the trouble is that it looks like simple objects which have, it's natural to think that simple objects which have spatial location have a very, very small spatial location. So, you know, natural candidates for simple objects are kind of electrons, quarks, things that occupy a very small subatomic region. So it looks like, the worry is it looks like if I think my mind is a simple object with a spatial location, it looks like I'm going to have to think it occupies a really small subatomic region of my brain, right? And two clear problems that seem to follow from this. So firstly, it looks like we're going to have to think there's some special privileged part of the brain where, where the mind is located. So just as Descartes thought there was this special bit of the brain, the pineal gland, where the soul interacted with the brain, it looks like we're going to have to think similarly, there's a special bit of the brain where the mind is located. And empirically, that just doesn't seem to be the case. There doesn't seem to be some special privileged place. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, if my mind has just a single, very small location in my brain, it looks like it's not going to have much impact on my macroscopic behavior, right? We want it to be the case that my mind causes, what I'm saying now, that my mind, my understanding of the joke caused me to laugh, my feeling of pain caused me to scream and run away. But it looks like if my mind occupies, just a single, very small subatomic region of my brain, it looks like it's not going to be able to have that kind of impact on behavior. Okay, so how do we get around these very serious problems? So my suggestion is, that I'm trying to make sense of, is that, so my thought is that we have these problems only when we think that the mind occupies, we don't have these problems when we think that the mind occupies very small location. We have these problems when we think that it occupies only a single very small location. Whereas my proposal that I'm trying to make sense of is that the mind occupies many, many very small locations in the brain. So the mind is multiply located many, many times in the brain. So the analogies here to help you get a grip on this are Catholic saints and time travelers. So it's a very, according to Catholic doctrine, it's a very, bilocation is a very familiar miracle. We have these stories of saintly individuals being in two places at once. And this seems to be multiple location, one thing being wholly present in two distinct locations. Or time travelers, if you travel back 10 years and visit yourself 10 years ago and have a coffee with yourself, we would have a situation where we have one and the same individual at two places at the same time on either side of the coffee table. So this is what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting the mind is a single thing, the subject of my experience, that is located, is wholly present many, many times in the brain. Okay, and this gets around our two problems, right? Firstly, we don't have to think there's some special privileged location in the brain, because the mind is located many, many times in the brain. So over a large region of the brain, presumably the region a more conventional mind-body identity theorist would want to locate the mind/brain. And in fact, on this view, we could locate the mind at that point. So we can say there's this large region of the brain, the mind is located at that large region, but derivatively in virtue of being multiply located many times within that region. And it gets round the causal problems. Of course, if my mind has only one very small location in my brain, it can't have much impact on my behavior. But if it has many, many small locations in my brain, it can. So to return to the analogies, suppose you've got a Catholic saint who can't lift a table, it's too heavy. So what he does, he multiply locates himself 6 times and is able to pick up the table. Or to take the time traveler analogy, suppose you want to build up an army to fight your enemy. You might choose to go back in time and gather an army of your past selves. So you might end up with a huge army, all composed of the same individual. So this is what I'm suggesting could be the case. So if we open up my head, it might look like there are many distinct particles coming together cooperatively to govern my behavior, but perhaps it's just numerically one thing, multiply located many times, it's governing my behavior. Okay, that's the idea. So I just want to finish by sort of cashing out a little bit of how I'm thinking of the metaphysical underpinnings of this sort of mass multiple location. And I'm indebted to my thinking of this is influenced in large part by long conversations with Hedda Merck on the front row here and by Jonathan Simon, who's not at this conference. So we've got a little group of panpsychists at the moment in ANU and sort of really interesting ideas shooting around. Okay, but let me just tell you briefly about how I'm thinking of the metaphysical underpinnings. I'm not going to have time to go into much detail, and maybe it might be a little opaque if you don't sort of know about these things, but I'll just go through it quickly. So basically what I'm thinking is we can get this picture if we combine Aristotelian realism about universals, bundle theory of objects, and substantivalism about space. So the idea would be a sort of mosaic where we have space as a sort of object, fundamental object in its own right, particular object, and then a sort of mosaic of universals instantiated in ray universals over that kind of, over space. And then objects are just bundles of those universals at a given location. So once we adopt this picture, if we have two locations, x and y, at which are located all and only the same universals, then it will follow that we have a single object multiply located, wholly located at each of those locations, because objects are just bundles of universals, and universals are wholly present at each location where they are instantiated. Okay, so that's how I'm thinking about the metaphysical underpinnings. And once we've got the metaphysical underpinnings of this view, then there's this sort of the empirical task of trying to work out what the laws of nature must look like such that many regions of a functioning brain come to be occupied by all and only the same universals, and such that which universals these are is somehow determined by the structural properties of the whole brain. So, so there's a big empirical project, it's a big project here, trying to make sense of this view in its sort of early days. It might not, in the end, make sense, but I think, there's panpsychism is a very attractive view, and, I think it's worth pushing in this, looks like a promising direction for a non-reductive theory of consciousness. So, just to summarize the key points here, I take it that I believe that metaphysics is the project of bringing together empirical facts about causal structure and introspectable facts about consciousness. Panpsychism looks to be the most theoretically virtuous way of doing this, a theory we really ought to try and make work. The significant problem facing panpsychism is that phenomenal composition seems to be unintelligible, how to make sense of little subjects making big subjects. But we can perhaps avoid a need for phenomenal composition if we suppose that the mind is multiply located. And just finally, what we're ultimately going to be looking for if we sort of get to the empirical stage of this project is, rather than looking for the sort of neural correlates of consciousness, we're going to be looking for the neural correlates of mass multiple location in a way. But yeah, so might turn out not make sense, but I think worth giving it a go, see where it goes.
I see one at the back there. Yeah.
Hi. I think it was Michelangelo who said that his job as a sculptor was to liberate the statue from a block of stone. And I'm wondering, in terms of the composition problem, have you ever considered it that the fundamental particles have complete and total consciousness, and the composition problem is matter whittling away at this consciousness to create the differentiation that is a high level of consciousness?
So maybe I don't entirely get you. It sounded kind of a little bit like my proposal. I suppose this is a proposal where there really are no composite objects. There are just fundamental particles, or something like fundamental particles, that are doing sort of all the causal work, have all the phenomenal properties. But the trick is, some of them have many, many locations. So this is a view where there isn't really a composite object here. There are just little things arranged sort of table-wise. So it sounded a little bit like, maybe I misunderstood you. Well, we could talk.
So what's your story about the individuation of these universals that constitute you?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. I suppose I'm following the sort of David Armstrong type view of universals, that they are qualities that are wholly located in certain regions of space, and they are wholly present in each region in which they exist. And given it's a panpsychism, the form of panpsychism, all of those universals are going to be phenomenal universals, right? So they're going to be qualities of conscious experience, what its likeness properties. Is that enough individuation? Maybe I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm just wondering if you've got some kind of, I mean, like hexaides going on. Like, are they all like you? Is it you instantiated in all these different parts of your brain? And
there are no hexaides. So the picture is, I mean, there are particulars. There are regions of space. So this is the view, right? There's a particular space and its regions, particulars, and then there are bundles of phenomenal qualities, which are Aristotelian universals, and they are located at regions of space-time. Yeah, in a way, you can sort of think of it as a kind of, in a way, a sort of naturalistic substance dualism. If you think of, space as this sort of physical world, and the bundles of universals as sort of minds. But I don't know. But yeah, no hexaites though. No.
So why not go back to Leibniz? All those little monads yearning to get back together, perhaps asking, why can't we all get along?
I should read more Leibniz one of these days. But I don't know if this answers your question, but I mean, I'm persuaded actually that we've got a strong empirical case now that the properties of the brain and the causal goings-on in the brain are really dependent on the parts of the brain, that the sort of inanimate world is sort of causally closed. I think before the 20th century, emergentism was a serious empirical option, but I sort of think we know enough about the brain and enough about biology to rule that off. And I suppose that's an important empirical consideration that shapes what I'm doing here. So I'm trying to really, I mean, in a way, I think of consciousness as fundamental, but I also think there's a really important empirical fact that it looks like microphysical causal closure is sort of true in the brain, and I'm trying to somehow bring these two things together. So yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you.
But I can't help feeling you're confusing property instantiations with properties. So, for example, the universals are meant to be multiply located, but okay, so are you the universal, in which case you're abstract, or are you the concrete thing, in which case you're the property instantiation? But if you're the property instantiation, then you're not multiply located, you are, in other words, you're where you're instantiated. So in other words, you've got a big, large number of duplicates. In other words, little property instantiations, like little states of affairs, to use the Armstrongian picture. Within a substratum. So you don't have your multiple locations. So it's a dilemma. Either you've got no multiple location, or you're abstract. But if you're abstract, I think you need your hexaites. Because otherwise, how do I distinguish your mind from my mind? Because we'd both be kinds of the same kind of qualia universals or something.
So, good. Okay, so I'm thinking of universals in the Aristotelian tradition, so they're not abstract, like Plato believed. They're wholly spatiotemporally located, but so greenness is wholly present here and wholly present here. But I'm not so I believe in space as a particular, but I don't think the universals are instantiated. But because I have a bundle theory, so I'm combining it with a bundle theory. So the universals are. So it's not David Armstrong's view where you have substratum and universals. Yeah, then it wouldn't be multiple location. But I don't have a place in this for substratum. An object, a subject of experience, is just a bundle of universals which is located at a particular location. So they're neither abstract, but nor are they, strictly speaking, instantiated. So I think that gets around both those concerns.
Yeah, I think you're in desperate need of quantum physics.
Okay. You might say that.
The success of physics ran into two roadblocks a little over 100 years ago. Quantum theory and relativity. And both of them, I think, are relevant to consciousness and to your view. And I would go back to Leibniz, but then go forward to Whitehead, who noticed that consciousness is a sequence of events, occasions. And I think attributing consciousness to an object is the wrong thing. I think attributing consciousness to an event, like a quantum state collapse, in which the qualia are some irreducible component that derives from what's causing the collapse, might get you somewhere. That also gets you around the problem of the composition, because you can have quantum coherence, and so you can have multiple locations, but unity and solve the binding problem. So I would go into quantum physics.
But on a panpsychist version, or? I mean...
Pan-protopsychist, pan-experientialist.
Yeah, okay, so I mean, look, this is a general framework which could be filled out empirically in lots of different ways, and perhaps quantum stuff could have some bearing there. But I mean, I do want to stick to panpsychism, because I don't want to go to pan-protopsychism, because I mean, I don't see. I mean, the problem with pan-protopsychism is there are these properties, these proto-phenomenal properties that constitute everything except minds, and we really have no grip on what such things are. I think that panpsychism is a much more satisfying view, because the entirety of nature is comprehensible to us. So I do want to make sense of a kind of panpsychism rather than pan-protopsychism. And then I do think we face the composition problem. So if the intrinsic, we've got more basic physical things have a more basic phenomenal nature, and this somehow kind of adds up to more complex phenomenal nature, and I mean, that's where the trick sets in. But I mean, I guess we can have a long conversation about whether you think there's a quantum way around the composition problem, but at the moment, I'm not persuaded of that.
Okay, what Professor Hamroff has raised, that you must go into the quantum physics to understand this, but there are some philosophical problems also which you have expressed. The one is, if mind is multiplically located or in different time, in different space, then in a body, in a human body, what comes that a man is alive, and what goes that a man is dead? Good.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea would be that I mean, let's just talk about particles for the sake of simplicity. So we've got these particles that have a very simple phenomenal nature, and then in a living, functioning brain, they somehow they come to have a very complex phenomenal nature, and indeed, many regions of the brain come to have exactly the same nature, and because of the underlying metaphysics, that turns out, it follows that one thing is multiply located. When the person dies, presumably that ceases to be the case, so the multiple location will not be present anymore, and the distinct particles which remain will have a much more simple phenomenal nature. So there's I mean, you've got to think fundamentally, fundamentally what's going on is this mosaic picture. We've just got space and various universals located in different regions of space, and then we've got to look at the contingent laws of nature that can get us the kind of things we want to explain, like normal human consciousness in all its richness and variety. But yeah, so there's nothing extra added when someone's born, there's nothing extra left when someone dies, but multiple location will persist through life and cease at death.
What about the concept?
Sorry. Now we have time for a general discussion. Let's thank Philip first. Okay, I don't know if anybody on the panel has questions for each other. We've seen three remarkably convergent approaches to the explanatory gap here.
Yeah.
Can I've got things I'd like to ask both, but Tony, I'm just confused. I'm a bit confused by the metaphysics of your view. So, like those two, you describe those two worlds, A and B, one in which there's determinism and one in which there isn't. And it looks like it ought to be an objective fact about the world, whether determinism is true or not. But it looks on your view like it's dependent on how we conceptualize the world, whether determinism is true or not. That seems kind of wrong to me.
No, I think determinism's true, but I don't think it applies. It's not a system that you can use when you're interacting with someone else. So then you move into a different mode. Kind of, you might think of it as a rather like, if we're interacting with someone, we would predict them, we use different heuristics to understand how we should interact with them. And so that's where that framework is no longer useful, because your own responses are going to be picked up by the other person you're interacting with them. So then determinism may well be true, but it's not the framework that is with the heuristics that are useful to guide your interaction.
So now it sounds like it's just an illusion, the way we conceive of the world from the phenomenal stance. It's illusory, because we think it makes us conceive of a non-deterministic world, and the world is determined. I don't know.
Well, I don't think it's an illusion to realize that the principles of determinism and science aren't going to guide your interactions with someone else very effectively. But yes, it may seem, I mean, certainly there are formulations that will make it seem like an illusion. And so I think it's a mistake to imagine that that you should try and cash out the free will phenomenal and the notion of a soul, all of which in some sense I believe in, but to cash them out in terms of a mechanistic framework. You know, so let me come back at you, because I really liked your start, where you said, well, Descartes started like this, and indeed, you know, Descartes stripped out these, he came from Aristotle, and he got rid of, you know, this idea of the final, I forget the details. Okay, but anyway, and in that way he helped, he ushered in the scientific revolution and allowed biology to really take off. I actually think that Descartes had a real insight in realizing that there was something there that needed to be preserved, right? So I think it was certainly a mistake to, in my view, to imagine it was still there and should interact through the pineal gland. So here's where I depart from you. I wonder, why do you, if you're going to say that there's this other aspect to nature, why are you so concerned about its physical properties, its extension, its causal properties? I mean, you're just playing into the scientist's hands, as it were. I mean, if you're going to say it's not physical, say it's not physical.
Well, but I want to really believe in it. I want a unified picture. So, I mean, I still haven't done, it seems on your view, the only way, I'm inclined to interpret your view as phenomenology doesn't really exist. It's like this stance we can, you know, use to interpret people. It works very well. But the world isn't really like that. I mean, the world is evolved.
It's just like wave-particle duality. I mean, both are true. I mean,
you said determinism wasn't true.
Sorry?
You said determinism wasn't true.
Right, but, well, okay, I don't think determinism, I think, determinism is true, I said. Right, indeterminism isn't true, right? But,
yeah. Sorry.
You know, but that's an overarching theory. I still think that there is a sense in which it is true, and indeed, I think, a very important truth that souls exist, that moral truths exist, you know, that people have phenomenal states.
So just, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose maybe there's a different conception of what metaphysics is all about in the background here. I mean, yes, I don't think consciousness is physical, but I think it's a real concrete part of the world. We've got this real concrete phenomenon, consciousness, and then we've got these facts about causal structure, and I believe in both, and I want a unified picture that incorporates both.
And I kind of agree with you, and I think, you know, we live in a world that's so dominated by a materialistic scientific worldview, we think that the only way we can call something real is to say that it's got all these physical properties. But why play into that? I think actually that's a sort of strategic mistake.
Well, I suppose at root I find your view unintelligible. If you really believe in phenomenology and you know, there's one world out there, and we want to work out what it's like. I mean, I just can't make sense of this, that there are just two different stances, but they're somehow...
Well, I like the articulation Stephen Jay Gould gave in his non-overlapping magisteria, and that's probably more elegant than I can state it.
I mean, are the souls or aren't there? Is the determinism true or isn't there? Are the phenomenal properties or...
The souls,
it's like relativism or something.
But they're souls, but they're thoroughly non-physical, right? No, they don't have any physical properties at all. They certainly don't have extension and causal properties.
So you're just a substance
but they
dualist?
Exist.
So you're just a substance dualist? You're a substance dualist?
No, because substance is a physical concept, isn't it? I mean...
It's a metaphysical concept. It's a concept of a thing that has properties. I mean, I just can't find a view into the middle way between saying substance dualism and, you know, intentional stance where it's really an illusion.
Well, this is really fun, but we're hogging too much time. We can argue over a drink.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, general questions. Pete here.
I have a question to Dr. Jack. Did you mean to call Dr. O'Regan a psychopath? Because I think indirectly that's what you have done. Now, there is research that about 30% of people don't see first-person perspective as really deeply different. Do you want to call all the 30% of people psychopaths?
I mean, I think that people who are completely unable to see the first-person perspective are likely to be suffering from some serious interpersonal problems. You know, whether you want to exactly call it psychopathy or not, yeah, I'm happy with that label. I think I was very clear that I'm not applying this to academics because, and I had a slide for that effect, because you know, I think that when your reasoning is being driven by a whole bunch of intellectual considerations, it becomes much less likely that it's just the sorts of intuitive pulls that I imagine to be the things that are pushing the opinions in my less educated undergraduates, or less conversant with this issue undergraduates. The very well educated, the ones who go to my classes, yeah, right.
It's a question for Kevin. I'm really sympathetic to the project to make qualia, kind of take them out of the epiphenomenal camp that seems very popular nowadays. So I really think it's very important to integrate them in the causal order of the world. I even accept that you might be able to describe laws of interaction with objects whereby if I instance such a law, I would have to be experiencing a red quale. Okay, so I'll go with you that far. But it seems to me it's another step to say that all there is to that red quale is such interaction. I mean, it's one thing to say that a quality is constrained by its causal profile. It's quite another thing to say that all it is a set of, as it were, relational, dispositional, you know, a profile. So I wonder why you want to take that extra step. What motivates you to do that?
I think you have to be as extreme as possible and to see how far the argument goes. So it seems to me that if there were more, you would be back to the explanatory gap. If there were more, in what terms would you explain it?
Dave, can I follow on this? Sure. You know, where it really struck me as you know, unintuitive to me, how that the scheme could explain everything, was when you started talking about emotions. And I felt jealous that the embarrassment was so low on the scheme of experience for you. But sorry that love and joy and excitement were also so low. But look, I mean, it seems to me that emotions are incredibly salient, right? And I noticed that you kind of, in this arrow that went up, you said sensory phenomenal experience. And so, I mean, again, coming back to how well can you explain everything for that particular class, which I think really puts pressure on this point of whether you can fully explain everything about them by the qualities you mentioned.
Yeah, because so my whole theory was about sensory experiences.
Right.
What I mean is like the 5 classic sense modalities. And maybe if we could go further and incorporate emotions in it, but then we would need additional mechanisms, I think, that we would have to build in. But I think it would be possible. For example, what characterizes emotions is that they're accompanied by physical manifestations in the body, which normal sensations are not accompanied by. And I think adding that in, for example, I have another concept I call automaticity, which maybe you might invoke for pain, for example. If you stick your finger in the fire, well, your finger just jerks back automatically. So this is another objective fact about certain modes of interaction that you have with the world. Emotions, for example, objectively